Welcome in, everyone. Ready for a deep dive that's a little, well, meta.
Meta. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So today we're focusing on someone who's thinking about how tech shapes our lives.
Hmm.
Liat, a business development specialist right here in Silicon Valley.
Oh, interesting. And we've got her articles, even a bio, to get into the nitty-gritty of her work. This is like a deep dive into the mind of someone shaping the future.
Exactly. And Liat, it's pronounced Liat. By the way, she's not just about algorithms and code. She's connecting those dots between hardcore tech and, well, us humans.
That human element is key, especially with all this talk about zero trust architecture, ZTA. It's one thing to talk firewalls and data, but Liat digs into what that means for people.
Right. Like, how do we live in a world where we have to constantly verify everything and everyone? But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's introduce Liat properly. She's a consultant, yeah, but not the stereotypical number cruncher. Her background is fascinating. Industrial engineering and an MBA. Talk about well-rounded.
It's like she's got the brains and the business sense, which is probably what you need when you're talking about disruptive tech in Silicon Valley.
100%. We're talking attending conferences for startups, boots on the ground support for companies in the thick of it. She even writes content, but it's not just jargon. It tells a story.
Ah, so she gets it. Knowing how to communicate these complex ideas is crucial, especially when you're trying to build bridges across cultures, and that seems to be a big theme for her.
Oh, absolutely. Lee sees that global, interconnected world, and she's asking, how do we build trust, real connections, when everything's changing so fast?
Uh-huh.
And that brings us to her take on zero trust architecture, or ZTA.
Which is a whole other beast, right? It's like she's saying, okay, we live in the cloud, it's our oxygen tube these days, we can't live without it, but...
But can we really live with it either? I mean, Lee compares losing your smartphone to losing a vital organ. We depend on this stuff, but how does that dependence shape our behavior?
Exactly. And if we're constantly worried about security, about someone or something accessing our data, our lives, well, that's where ZTA comes in, but it's not exactly a warm hug, is it?
Not exactly. It's more like trust no one, verify everything all the time. And while that makes sense from a security standpoint, Light doesn't just stop there. She asks, what does that do to us?
Oh.
Like, really, what does that never trust mentality do to a person? Especially if you're in IT and dealing with this stuff day in and day out.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. It's a heavy question for sure. And it really makes you wonder, are we sacrificing a bit of our humanity for the sake of security? Because we're talking about this very primal need to connect, to trust, and ZTA almost feels like it's working against that.
Yeah, it's like, are we hardwiring suspicion into our systems and by extension into ourselves?
Mm.
And Laya takes that question even further. She brings it right into our living rooms, our phones, the age of social media.
Right. Like it's already hard enough to navigate this world of online personas, dating apps, scams galore. Are we adding fuel to the fire here? It's a valid concern, right? I mean, we talk about a trust deficit in society, but are we actually contributing to it with this never trust approach to tech? Especially for kids growing up immersed in this. If even the systems are built on constant verification, what message does that send? How do you learn to trust, to connect authentically in that kind of environment?
It's a bit of a mind bend, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, are we inadvertently creating a generation that's primed to be suspicious, even paranoid?
And not just paranoid, but potentially isolated, anxious. Lia doesn't sugarcoat the potential downsides. That this constant, always-on suspicion, it takes a toll.
And what's fascinating to me is how Liat's own background plays into this. Because she's not just a techie, she's a consultant. And she specifically focuses on cross-cultural understanding.
Which adds a whole other layer, doesn't it? Because if it's already hard to build trust across cultures with different communication styles, different values, imagine trying to do that when you're also battling this underlying assumption of distrust.
Right. It's like we're playing relationship Jenga with the blindfold on. And it's not just personal relationships. Leia takes us straight to the boardroom.
Oh, yeah. She doesn't hold back. Because what happens to business deals, to innovation, to collaboration when you're constantly looking for the catch, the angle, the potential threat?
It's like we're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then, of course, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the AI revolution that's already knocking on our door.
Which makes this whole trust issue even more urgent, doesn't it? Because if we can't even figure out how to trust each other, how do we build AI that's ethical, that's trustworthy, that we can actually feel good about using?
That's the million-dollar question for sure. It's like, do we trust the tech enough to let it lead us into the future? Or does the tech need to earn our trust first? Which kind of puts us in this weird loop.
Yeah, feels like we're stuck between a rock and a hard drive or something. So how do we even begin to untangle this? Does Liat offer any solutions, or are we just left with this trust dilemma? Well, she's not about offering easy answers, more like guideposts, you know? Like a big one for her is remembering that tech isn't the whole story. It's not like we can just invent a trust app and call it a day. This goes deeper. We have to address the human side of the equation.
Okay, that makes sense. So more like recognizing the limits of tech,
hmm
that it's a tool, not a cure-all for what's going on in society.
Exactly. And maybe part of that is being more nuanced in how we think about trust itself. Like
Yeah.
it's not an on-off switch, right? It's
Yeah.
not blind faith versus total paranoia. There's a whole spectrum in between.
Oh, I like that. So being more discerning, but not letting that tip over into being constantly suspicious. Finding that balance is key.
Right. Like it could be as simple as being more aware of how we're interacting online. Are we being mindful of what we share, how we engage, knowing that it does bleed over into our offline lives?
Yeah, that whole digital self thing is no joke. It's all connected. But then there's that awareness of how tech itself can be used to mislead, to manipulate.
Absolutely. Building those critical thinking muscles is more important than ever. Being able to spot misinformation, propaganda, even just a sales pitch disguised as a friendly suggestion.
Right, like having a good BS detector is basically a survival skill these days. But okay, so being more aware, more discerning, that's part of it. What else?
Communication. Can't forget that. Especially as those lines between work, personal life, everything gets blurrier. Liat talks about being upfront about expectations, about security, about privacy.
Especially in the workplace, right? Because that's a breeding ground for misunderstandings if everyone's got different ideas about what's acceptable.
And that's where transparency is huge. It's not about blind trust, it's informed consent. Everyone knows what the rules are, what the risks are, and they can make informed choices based on that.
So much better than just assuming, right? Which kind of brings us full circle to Liat's big question. How do we redefine trust in this age of AI, where things are only going to get more complex?
That's the million-dollar coin, and honestly, I don't know if we have a clear answer yet. But I do think Liat's onto something with that idea of redefining trust.
Meaning, it's not just about going back to some idealized past where everything was simpler. We have to find new ways of building trust, new models that work for this new landscape.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, this whole zero trust architecture thing, it's not really about never trusting at all. Maybe it's a stepping stone to something else.
Oh, interesting. You're saying it's less about building walls and more about finding new ways to connect, but doing it in a way that's informed, that's mindful, that acknowledges the complexities of the digital world.
Right. Like a more mature, more conscious approach to trust. And that's something I think we could all get behind, right?
100%. It's about embracing that complexity, the good, the bad, and finding ways to move forward with both caution and curiosity.
Because at the end of the day, tech is just a tool. It's up to us to figure out how to use it in a way that benefits humanity, not hinders it.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself. So to everyone listening, keep those questions coming, keep those critical thinking caps on, and let's keep this conversation about trust and tech going. It's a big one, but hey, that's what deep dives are for, right?
Couldn't agree more. Until next time, everyone.